listening to the Digitally Irresistible podcast, where we cover the optimization of digital technologies and irresistible people. Brought to you by iCore. Each episode features someone who sheds a little more light on the ins and outs of delivering a great employee and customer experience that has a measurable impact on the business. And now, here's today's guest. Welcome to another episode of the Digitally Irresistible podcast. I'm your host, Bernie Borges. Today's guest is Jermaine Edwards. Welcome, Jermaine.
Hey, Bernie. Great to be here.
Great to have you here today, Jermaine. Jermaine, you are a leading customer growth expert. You're an advisor, an international speaker, and award-winning author. You spent over 20 years working with companies from SMEs to global organizations to help build their customer advantage and grow their customers year on year. Since 2016, your clients have delivered more than $250 million in value to their customers. Jermaine, on this episode, I'm excited to discuss with you the secrets of unshakable loyalties. But first, Jermaine, you know the drill. Before we get to that, let's hear your backstory. How did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction, Bernie. Yeah, so I often like to kind of begin with this particular fact that I'm a Jamaican farm boy who grew up in London, studied in Germany, and then became a customer growth fanatic because of great mentors I had along the way. But equally so, what I found was that the companies that I was associated with that were most successful had the strongest leanings toward being customer oriented. And so I took that and said, well, what if that could be translated to small businesses and give them a needed advantage to grow their business, particularly in tough climates, but also transform the way in which they partner with their teams, people, and their communities. And so that's been my passion for the last, I'd say now almost 8, 9, almost 10 years, advising, building, and teaching on those things.
Fantastic. Well, let's get into it. I love your concept of unshakable loyalty. I mean, I've heard of loyalty, but unshakable loyalty, let's begin with why do CX leaders even need to plan for unshakable loyalty?
Well, here's what's interesting is that I think a lot of the times we talk about loyalty, we don't talk about the distinctions in which loyalty actually exists. And typically there are actually kind of 3 types of loyalty that are typically discussed in the area of loyalty. But oftentimes we talk about them as individuals. And so you have individual, loyalty, such as rational loyalty, emotional loyalty, behavioral loyalty. What we don't necessarily talk about is what would need to be true for actually our business to have something that is beyond those things. And I call those unshakable loyalty. And this is when a customer sees and acknowledges the relationship with you as just as important as the product or service they're actually involved with. And unshakable loyalty taps into a known and observable quality that often gets missed and undervalued with businesses, and that is shared values. And the research behind this is actually almost irrefutable to some degree, that when you have shared values-led conversations with customers, it leads to a loyalty that is much more distinct, much more powerful, much more palpable, and actually brings people together in a much more cohesive ways.
The way you're explaining it, Jermaine, it feels like there's an emotional connection in place between the customer and the brand. So why do you think companies struggle to even find and benefit from this level of loyalty?
Yeah, I think there were kind of 2, maybe even kind of 3 kind of reasons for this. I think the first of this is that oftentimes, particularly in marketplaces, we're talking about technology, and we're not necessarily talking about the psychology of what it means to connect in the relationships that we have with our customers. And so there are kind of 3 kind of tenets of that. There's psychology, which is what we believe, understand, value, and actually how we're associated and connected with other people. Then we have proximity, which is really about not necessarily just physical closeness, but it's social proximity, it's psychological proximity, it's social proximity. It's in these realms of how close we are with the people that are in our life. And then we have power, which is the influence that we have with people based on the psychology beliefs, our proximity, how connected we are. And then obviously that gives us then leverage to have deeper and more rich conversations. And so most businesses focus on the latter, which is in how do we get more power or proximity. And so proximity being how do we get our technology aligned? How do we get in front of our customers more? And power, so how do we influence our customers along the way? What we don't necessarily focus on is the psychology. And then psychology is really the linchpin that connects those things together, which is around our shared values. And when we aren't focused on that, that then simply means that we fall into the trap of the illusion that our communication that we're having with customers is really taking place when actually it's falling onto deaf ears because the beliefs and the shared values just aren't there.
At iCore, we help companies design self-service support that is both convenient and personal to their customers. From intelligent virtual assistants powered by the latest in natural language processing technology to video tutorials, iCore is leading the way in keeping customers happy and on the go. Smile with iCore. Learn more at iCore.com.
Okay, I like your point about how a lot of organizations really struggle with the psychology connection to loyalty. So, what are some strategies, whether they're conventional or unconventional strategies, that brands can really adopt to get customers to engage with their brand?
Yeah, well, there's one particular that I really like talking about, and it's a particular principle called the endowed progress effect, which kind of connects to this area of psychology and proximity and power. And so the principle here is this, that it's the idea that there is some type of artificial advancement toward a goal. A person that sees this specific goal and is aligned to those goals tends to be motivated to complete the goal when it's something that is deeply intrinsically connected to them personally. And so an example of that would be something really, really simple. So let's just say that we're wanting to, with a particular set of customers, maybe a segment of customers, have them be much more engaged in the adoption of a particular product. Well, rather than just going out and educating the client, we actually work in advance. And we'd say, well, what is the specific outcome that is connected to these particular clients that they are intrinsically motivated to go and achieve based on the products and services that we have? And so we start with the goal and we work backwards and we say, well, what is this thing right now that they believe about that outcome, that we can begin to show them in the actions, that when they take this next step, it actually emotionally satisfies them and practically helps them to move towards that success. And so an example of that would be at stage one, you might say, okay, well, when we have this level of education, when we have this particular step, maybe it's a webinar or it's an event, this helps our client to not only align their own teams, but it helps them to understand exactly how this contributes to the emotional satisfaction and the practical outcome of a specific goal that they have. And that could be something as simple as in the communication with client, actually stating those beliefs out loud. So an example would be, I'm speaking to a client and I'm saying, rather than leading with the product, I lead with a belief. So saying, hey, we believe that with this specific product, it helps us to connect on your high value, which is, let's just call it alignment. And so alignment is a particular high value for this particular client. We say, so we believe that this particular next step for you actually helps us to drive alignment, which then moves us towards this specific goal in the end. And so what we'd like to do is make sure that we have alignment as the highest value between us, so that as we move between these steps, we can actually have meaningful progress. And so for every single step, you simply begin to demonstrate to the customer that you've understood what they care about, you've understood what they value, you understood the outcome, and then you begin to plant these steps. And when they see that you've actually worked that out, they're actually much more willing to take those steps with you. And you can literally do this with literally hundreds of different customers at one time, particularly because they're coming to you for a very specific reason, and begin to map this out. It takes a little work up front, but the whole point of the progress effect is that most people will begin to move towards things they're intrinsically motivated towards. But you have to understand what they value first and what they care about before you get them there.
What really resonates with me, Jermaine, in that explanation you just shared is the human connection that you're describing that the brand makes with the customer. And it resonates with me because of who we are at iCore. I mean, I was sharing with you before we recorded, the irresistible part of our podcast name is all about that human connection. So I really appreciate how you explain that and how, again, that just highlights the importance of that human connection, the empathy, the psychological connection. What are the stories that companies really need to know about in order to build stronger, greater relationships that can build this unshakable loyalty?
Yeah, well, there are really kind of three stories that show up for every single business. So if I think about this, there's actually, I often talk about a particular experience I had back at the back end of 2019. I traveled to 22 different countries and I was ending a trip in Senegal at a place called Gorée Island. And in Gorée Island is a beautiful setting. Imagine just, the kind of tranquil beaches and kind of almost a Caribbean feel, shop vibe of moving between different kind of cabins that are selling kind of local goods. And I met a person named Steve. And this person, Steve, was a master sand painter. And in that particular interaction, he started to ask me some questions about the things that I care about because he was painting things that are personal to other people. So he began to ask me some questions. Hey, what are some things that you care about? What are some things that you're doing right now? And I talked about my family. I have 6 kids and I love them to death, my wife included in that. And he began to paint this particular scenario using the canvas that he had, using the sand. And so there we have an illustration of the first story. Which is the story between a relationship with the person or the company that we're actually doing business with. The second story is actually a relationship between us and the product directly. So he's showing me the sand. I'm involved in actually participating in the sand painting itself. And he's helping me work with that as we're crafting this paint together. That's the second story. But there's a third story that's implicit, it's unseen, it takes a little kind of more digging to get to. And that's the questions that he asked me at the beginning, which is, what do I care about? Now, he didn't have to ask that question. He could have said, hey, what kind of painting do you want to kind of take from the wall? And I could just pick that painting from the wall and move on and get on my way because they were beautiful. But the fact of asking those questions took me to story 3, which is the story of what we share together. What is the value that we are creating together? And where are those shared values actually centered? So those 3 stories of the relationship between the customer and your company, customer and your product, and the customer and the shared experience that you have together are the 3 stories that you need to master in order to get unshakable loyalty.
That's fantastic. I appreciate that explanation and that specific example that you shared. How common is this among brands to actually understand the importance of developing unshakable loyalty and then actually developing strategies for it?
Yeah, it is still pretty rare. There are some brands that do this really, really well. In fact, there are a number of different examples out in the world of this happening, right from kind of pop groups to very well-known brands in the technology space, to retail locations, to sports teams. Anywhere you go and you feel like a deep connection and affinity to that specific brand, it's usually connected to an emotion. It's connected to a belief or a value that you have. And so I'll take one particular brand, which is a very known shoe brand that's out there in the marketplace. And when you go to their specific website, what's actually shown is not just shoes, but it's actually causes. So you don't actually just go to that place to buy shoes. You actually go there to make a difference. And that is the distinction that they're making. And so the reason why they have such fanatical fans, this particular brand, and where they have people who literally repeat customers that come back at a 93% return rate to those specific brand, that particular brand, is because of that shared value. They're not just buying shoes, they're actually making a difference in the purchase of the shoes.
Yeah. The word that comes to mind is pride. As a consumer, if there's a brand that I have unshakable loyalty to, then I have pride in my relationship with that brand.
Mm.
And as a consumer, when I have that emotion, I would think that that's an emotion that the brand really values, that they want to get to that level of relationship with the consumer, where the consumer has pride in their relationship. Would you agree?
Agreed. Absolutely. I mean, pride is an extremely strong emotion. And particularly when you think about the level of kind of disruption that happens within our marketplace and industries all the time, what you want is in those specific moments of choices that a brand has, you want the emotional connection with your brand to be stronger than the product or service. Because guess what? Here's the reality is products and services become obsolete all the time. And actually, there's the very innovation that you're doing right now in your business, somebody's probably done that 10 times over right now in a different place. And so the reality of it is that we're always playing catch up with our products and services. But what we don't necessarily play catch up on, if we're doing it right and we're really talking about the stories and mastering the stories, are emotions, are the shared values, not just emotions and feelings, but I'm talking about the actual shared beliefs that we have with our clients about why and when and how we do business together.
Agreed. Agreed. Well, Jermaine, before we bring things to a wrap and I ask you the fun question,
Yeah,
where can people learn more about what you've got going on in your world and connect with you?
absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn at Jermaine Edwards. They can also find me at my website, jermaineedwards.com. Lots of things happening there. Lots of changes, lots of amazing work, and you can also see the schedule of events that's coming up as well, where you can hear me speak, or even think about inviting me to your own company as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, Jermaine, we get to the fun question. We have a tradition here on the Digitally Irresistible podcast. We want to know, when you're not working, what do you like to do for fun?
Yeah, well, actually, it's pretty boring to some degree. Is I actually really enjoy orchestral music, so I tend to go to the theater. I love hearing strings. I used to play the cello myself. My oldest daughter, plays the violin, and she's been part of a string quartet for a number of years and played for London Symphony Youth Orchestra. So we've been avid kind of followers and listeners in that end.
Well, I wouldn't characterize that as boring. If that's fun for you and enjoyable, and I would say probably even very gratifying for you, given that you used to play the instrument, that
Yeah,
sounds like a wonderful activity and sounds like a family activity as well. So that's great. Thank you for
indeed.
sharing that. And Jermaine, just thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me here on this episode of the Digitally Irresistible podcast. This is a really key topic, unshakable loyalty. I think, as we discussed, more brands really need to be thinking about building that emotional connection to build that level of loyalty that you characterize here as unshakable loyalty. So thank you for sharing your expertise and for joining me on this episode of the Digitally Irresistible podcast.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks, Benny.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Digitally Irresistible podcast, where we cover the optimization of digital technologies and irresistible people, delivering a great employee and customer experience that has a measurable impact on the business. Brought to you by iCore. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast player so you don't miss future episodes.